welcome back to another episode of Harlem Stories. I'm Robert Lazo.
I'm Adam Feinberg.
And today, Adam and I are going to be talking about defining what you want when you can't explain it.
Yeah. It's a very common scenario that we come across.
And I guess we should explain what we mean by what I want. We're talking about in terms of a place to live, whether it's an apartment or a townhouse.
Yeah, and whether it's a rental or a sale. Very often, we have clients that come to us, and that's pretty normal when they come to us and they're like, well, we want to buy something or we need to rent something, and, we have a vague idea of what we want, and, help us find it. And we say, sure, of course, yeah. And we start discussing with them, what some of their priorities are and what it is that they're looking. So there are different kind of considerations to take in when you're typically talking about rental versus sales. Let's talk about rentals first.
Okay.
So on the rental side, you typically have this time frame where you have to rent something. So usually the first question out of an agent's mouth when they're asking about rentals is, when do you need to move by? So that is really going to usually be the determinant. On a typical rental, and obviously it's going to depend on the client and the situation, it's usually going to be within 30 days or so, sometimes 45 or 60, but rarely much more than that.
And the other thing that other question in terms of rentals is what is your budget? And just a quick shorthand, that would be ideally, in terms of qualifying, is basically take your gross income and divide by 40, and that will be your top level in terms of what the most that you could really want to spend for a rental unit.
Yeah, so that 40-time qualifier is pretty much universally accepted throughout the city. Ultimately, pretty much every landlord is going to wind up looking for it. Now, the possible exceptions are going to be when you're looking at small landlords, or perhaps, renting an individual condo unit. So in the cases of the individual condo unit, you might be able to go back to the individual owner and make your case on, what might potentially work. Are they a strong candidate? Do they have a great work history? And things like that. So it's possible you could say, they don't earn the 40 times the rent, but, they're pretty close and they've got a strong credit and they've got a great job. They're professional, and they're going to try and make this as easy as possible for you.
So one thing I want to point out about this 40 times the gross rent needs to be your income. So I kind of did it. Normally when you hear what I just said, this is the qualification. They're going to say your income needs to be 40 times the gross rent. So what I did just a moment ago is just took that and went a little bit backwards. I said, just take your annual income, divide by 40, and that's your top end of your budget. Now, I should explain, and of course Adam is saying, not all the time, but I should explain why that's an important ratio. And that is because ideally, a landlord doesn't want you to spend more than 30% of your paycheck on housing, and neither do you. So, ideally, 25% would be a better amount, but in general, to qualify as a renter, you need to be spending not more than 30% of your paycheck.
Yeah, and the risk to the landlord is rather substantial. I know that a lot of people tend to vilify landlords, but in the current environment, it's a lot of risk for a landlord to take on. I mean, if they're a huge landlord, maybe they won't feel the pain, but a lot of landlords in New York City are not necessarily these mega huge corporations. A lot of times they might be small mom and pop type of landlords, and quite honestly, it's very difficult and extremely expensive and very time consuming to evict somebody. So nobody really wants it to get to that stage. That's a really important aspect for consideration of the landlord.
So back to our primary topic is defining what I want when I can't explain it. So I guess needless to say, if you're renting or if you're owning, you want something that you can afford.
Right. And when it comes to the purchasing side of the equation, it's a very different story. First off, it's rarely as time constrained as, on the rental side. But most importantly, if you're buying a co-op, the co-op boards are going to have, quite a number of restrictions. And if you've listened to some of our other episodes, we talked about all those extreme level of qualifications that co-op boards require. In a condo, it is nowhere near as restrictive, but you still will need a bank or all cash in order to be able to purchase the apartment or the home. These are important considerations that are the first things to help define what it is that you're looking for, to purchase. So we start going down the list, and a lot of times it's like one of the things that we will have is that it's important to provide a lot of feedback to your agent as we go through the search. And we'll ask you questions such as, where do you want to live? What neighborhoods are you willing to consider? What neighborhoods are you not willing to consider? And is there a specific reason why you want to be in those neighborhoods? Because sometimes we can stretch the location a little bit and find something that is your absolute dream apartment, but it was just outside the boundaries of what you're looking at.
And then after that, we would be discussing apartment size. Essentially, how much space do you need? How many rooms, whether it's a studio or a one-bedroom, two-bedroom, or more. The number of bathrooms, whether you need one, 1.5, 2, or more.
Yeah, and we also urge a lot of caution in terms of judging a space by its pure square footage, because quite honestly, there's multiple ways that people measure square footage, whether they're using usable square footage, gross square footage. I think the square footage topic is for another entire conversation, but, just wanted to, kind of put that out there at a bare minimum at this stage.
So right now we've got 3 factors that we brought up. Number 1 is affordability. Number 2 is location or neighborhood. And number 3 is apartment size. Are there any other factors?
Oh yeah, there's quite a number. So obviously, if you're considering co-ops into the equation, you're going to want to know, do they allow subletting? Do they allow dogs? Do they allow pied-à-terres? And these are just some of like the kind of almost, let's call it, I don't know, under the category of maybe legal categories and usability categories, as opposed to, the style of the apartment, or, the features of the apartment, or the features of the building.
So now we've begun to realize that there are a lot of factors, and ultimately, how do you decide?
Well, that's the big question, and for each individual buyer, that is going to be a unique factor. And quite honestly, some people, immediately have in their head exactly what they want. They're able to identify at least what they want right away. While others need to go to many homes and, make that distinction, among that. I think the key is, like, for if you are having a difficult time trying to define what it is that you want, I think it's important to provide, after each home that you view, to provide feedback to your agent on what you liked, what you didn't like, and that way we can incorporate it into the search going forward.
And we might as well bring this up now because it's very important to realize it's tough, but there are always going to be trade-offs.
Yeah. With almost every buyer, and it doesn't matter whether your budget is $500,000 or whether your budget is $30 million. We've seen it all, and the vast majority of homes and the vast majority of searches, for that matter, do require at least some sort of trade-off. Now, sometimes those trade-offs are really insignificant. Other times the trade-offs are significant. What are the most common ones? Are the ones that, like, I know that was going to be the next question, wasn't it? I see you smiling on that.
Yeah, I was gonna ask if you can provide some examples, but yeah, you kind of have read my mind.
Yeah, exactly. So because we come across this, so frequently, sometimes the trade-offs can be really small. So, for instance, it's like, maybe, looking at a neighborhood a few blocks away from where you thought you wanted to be. Or alternatively, maybe you thought you wanted a pre-war, and in fact, like, after seeing enough pre-wars, you've decided, I want a newer construction building. Sometimes it's, okay, I'm like, this apartment has this amazing view, but they don't allow dishwashers. So, it sometimes is obvious. I'm like, okay, I can live without a dishwasher, or, very often I think the most common two that I come across are going to be usually either location or price are usually going to be the two most common trade-offs that we come across.
So let's talk about, you mentioned it before, priorities. Now, how does a person determine the priorities?
Well, I think for each person, it's going to be individual and understanding what their needs are. And that's what we are here to kind of help weed out. So if you know that you're going to be looking, that you're a fresh married couple and that you're going to be looking to have kids, that starter apartment, depending on, where you are in your careers, maybe that starter apartment doesn't really work very well. And maybe you hold off on the search for a little while until you can afford a larger apartment, anticipating the need to grow relatively soon, so that you're not buying that starter apartment and then going through the purchase and sale process and all the transaction costs that includes. So, in a scenario like that one, obviously there's going to be quite a number of trade-offs and making that determination based on your expectations there. But could it be maybe you just wanted a shorter commute? Let's say you wanted a 15-minute commute. Will you be willing to do an 18 or 20-minute commute? Will that really make enough of a difference in your lifestyle to make that determination? And I think realistically, these are the kind of questions that we're always asking our clients on, to consider. I'm like, what were you including in your assumptions and why you wanted this neighborhood? Or, could you afford more, to get that apartment that you're really dreaming of? But you really didn't want to spend it. So these are the things that we're going to ask you to prioritize. We're going to ask you to give real consideration to. And, for each particular buyer, there might be other ways around these scenarios too that we can help you work on. So, for instance, if you were looking at a mortgage of, 3.5%, but you're looking in a neighborhood that qualifies for, let's say, Community Reinvestment Act loans, where you can certainly get much, much lower interest rates, then that's going to be able to help you stretch your dollars. Or what if you said, I'm like, I can only afford an apartment up to $750,000. And they're assuming that the monthly carrying costs, the common charges and taxes on a condo, are going to be $1,200 a month. Well, what if they're realistically only $600 a month, and the building is well funded and well handled? So the reality is, if they're only $600 a month, that gives you an extra $600 a month to play with. Well, if you're looking at today's interest rates, you're probably looking at somewhere between $100,000 and $150,000 added to a budget that you can now afford. So, these are some of the reasons why it's really so important to discuss like all these different variables with your agent to kind of help you find some of the best solutions.
So I'll give you an example of in terms of prioritization. So I have a client I'm working with right now that they want to walk to work. So that's a very, very specific geographic requirement. Probably more popular now because of COVID, and if you want to avoid having to travel on public transportation, specifically the subway, it makes a lot of sense. However, that will limit your options. And the other thing that I always think about is like, well, what's walking distance now to work today might not be walking distance, a few years down the line when perhaps you get another job.
Yeah, and even if you wanted to avoid public transportation, there's more city bikes than ever. Is a possible solution. Or I see everyone on these e-scooters now. Whether that's the right solution for you or not, I mean, that's only something that you can answer. But at the same time, it's the reality is our roles are as advisors, and as a result of that, the reality is we're helping you ask the important questions that you're going to need in your home search that really could make a huge difference in your future going forward and how comfortable you are in your home.
So let's talk a little bit about light and views, because those are other things that are popular in terms of what people are looking for in an apartment.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, the difference is quite significant in terms of light. Something that is south facing on a high floor is typically going to be like very much desired, but of course at the same time, that desirability also translates into much higher cost. If you're looking at something that is north facing and on a low floor, and is like obstructed by other buildings, that's typically going to be a very dark apartment, not as desired. And, there's got to be something else offsetting that in order to kind of keep the price, at a higher level. So, less desirable equals lower price typically.
And again, talking about trade-offs, I mean, I think a north-facing apartment can be really good, especially if you have a good view. It might not be a direct light, but in many cases, sometimes the apartment can be cooler than a south-facing apartment that would be warmer.
Yeah, yeah, and on top of that, with north facing, especially if it's kind of an open view, or just just not obstructed, anywhere nearby. The other component is that you'll get natural light throughout the day, but not direct. So that that's going to be one of the cooler aspects. I've sold apartments that are north facing that feel extremely open, and I think that's really an important part going forward. And that's actually they weren't really too keen on northern facing apartments, but at the same time we're willing to consider it for the right apartment. And sure enough, we found them the right apartment that had north facing windows, but it was so light and bright with giant windows that it really helped make that difference.
Another thing, an advantage of a north-facing apartment, I guess it depends upon which side of the street. If it's on the north side of the street,
yeah,
it can be a quieter apartment because if it's on the north side, that means the south-facing apartment would be facing the street itself. The north-facing apartment would be at the back of the building. And then depending on the building, it could be looking out at a courtyard across the way, or another building, or the worst would be a wall. But hopefully that wouldn't be the case.
Yeah, and obviously what you're talking about is apartments or homes that are on streets as opposed to the avenues, because the avenues tend to go north and south, with the buildings tend to be on the east and west sides. So, a lot has to do with the orientation and where you're located. And, a lot of times, clients ask me, how do I figure these things out? And a lot of it is just understanding the way the city grid is laid out. And, when we're walking through buildings, I'll be glad to point these things out. You do it often enough, you start getting accustomed to, what to look for. And that's another key thing that we'll walk through as an agent and help you make some of these determinations on.
Okay, so we're going to take a little break, and then we'll be right back. We're back. We are talking about defining what it is you want when you can't explain it, when you're looking for a home. Oftentimes there are trade-offs. And the way that you get through this is providing feedback to your agent, whoever you're working with, to help you decide. And then also the importance of being able to prioritize. What is the most important? Is it the location? Is it the space? Is it the light? How can you kind of negotiate through all of these different features and determine which one is going to be best for you?
Yeah, what I've found is that majority of clients feel like they go into this process, wanting the sun, the moon, and the stars, and they don't necessarily always have the budget for that, for everything that they want, where they want it, and how they want it. So the reality is, we do find the need to compromise, and it really comes down to, I ask our buyers typically, to prioritize what it is that they feel is the most important things. What can they potentially live without? And when you get a client that, that says, I'm like, okay, there's nothing that I'm willing to compromise on. This is my bare minimum list. The reality is, it's not that like those situations are absolutely impossible. Sometimes they might be, but more often than not, it's we have to tell them that the reality is, it could be a long while before you find what you want, if you ever do find what you want. We're going to be able to tell them what the norms are and even what some of the outliers might be, and whether one of those outliers might even be realistic for what it is that they're looking for. It comes down to situations where we occasionally do have to tell clients and say, while I understand what it is that you're looking for, the vast majority of times, we might have to tell them and say, listen, I'd love to be able to help you, but, in order for us to be able to work together and find you something realistically, we'll need to kind of make other prioritizations and some things that we'll need to budge on.
So let's talk just a little bit more about this topic and specifically about amenities. Now, amenities these are kind of the special features, usually oftentimes found in the newer buildings. Things like a gym, things like a pool, things like private deck. Not all the time. I mean, you can have pre-war buildings that have those, but in general, a lot of times the appeal of a newer building can be because of the amenities.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can find some existing structures, like, for instance, in the financial district, where buildings have been converted from office buildings where they might have a lot of amenities in those buildings to offset some of the other challenges that those buildings might have, or, just some of the challenges in space that they have. So, for instance, I know there's down in the financial district, there's an old vault that that they've kept the door of, and it's pretty cool as a nice, like, cool point to point out. But there's so much space down in that basement and cellar space that obviously that they just took the opportunity to add amenity after amenity down in that underground space.
So one of the things that I'd like to point out is that sometimes you can actually get by with not having amenities, especially, let's say, a gym. Right? Some people will say, I need a gym because at the middle of the night, especially if it's a 24-hour gym, I want to be able to have just be able to take the elevator down to the basement to the gym and work out and get back up without a problem. So that would be an example of where you wouldn't want to compromise with a gym, having a gym in the building. However, if, let's say, you are okay with leaving your apartment between going to work, stopping in at a gym, and in fact, some of these gyms are really, really fantastic. You can often find a better gym than outside of your building than you would find in a normal building. So that might free up your options if you're willing to compromise on a gym.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the typical building gym is not necessarily, built out the same way that you would find if you went to one of the large chains that are, found throughout New York City for the gyms. But there are some buildings that are, really high end, with their gyms and all their amenities for that matter. So it's really going to be a big determination. One thing to keep in mind with amenities, though, is if you're, whether you plan to use them or not, is something that you should really give some consideration to, because I would say the vast majority of amenities that most people are offered, they'll ask about them when they purchase, and that's probably, they might use it once or twice, but, very typically it's not something that they'll use on a regular basis.
And that's a very good point. So another popular amenity is like a roof deck or outdoor space. Again, what you're mentioning is sometimes it looks really great to have that amenity, to have the gym, but the question is, how often are you going to use it? Now, if you know for sure you're going to use it a lot, then you're going to definitely get value, and it'll be something that you want to focus on in your search. However, again, with outdoor space, let's just say that you have units very close to a park. Maybe you could compromise and give up on that requirement within the building in return for having, let's say, a park across the street.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the important things to note is, like, your monthlies are going to go up the more maintenance that you have, especially as, depending on the size of the building. So if you have a smaller building, for instance, one of my neighbors was asking about this building in central Harlem that had only 32 apartments, and the maintenance was astronomical for this size of the building, and the reason why is because they had a 12-hour doorman, and they also had a roof deck, and they had a gym, and they had a bunch of other smaller amenities. But the reality came to is having that doorman for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, is incredibly expensive for a small building. When you're only spreading those costs out over a handful of owners, it can get very expensive very quickly.
All right, very good. So thank you very much for joining us as we spoke about defining what you want or when you can't explain it, and hopefully we provided a couple helpful hints. You want to say anything, Adam?
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, I want to make sure that, like, when we're working with our clients, that, like, the most important thing is, number one, for you to communicate really what's important to you and why in your search. And that's the best way that we can really be of use to you and help to you in your search, because sometimes we'll be able to suggest something based on your description, and we'll know immediately what it is that you want. Or, whether, for instance, if you're looking for a high amenity building in a neighborhood that isn't known for that, there might only be a couple of options. So really important for you to kind of define that and, early on or as early as possible in the search. That way we can really help narrow down the selection, without kind of, letting the entire process drag on and on and on, of course, unless, of course, you say up front, I'm not in any hurry, in which a lot of our buyers will tell us we're not in any hurry. And, obviously, sometimes it's less about the timing and more about understanding what you want, so that, whether you're in a hurry or not, that we can help, make that dream happen sooner.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us with our episode of Harlem Stories, and we'll catch you next time.